The dog was screaming. Not barking. Not howling. Screaming, a low, aching, broken sound that no animal should ever make, not unless something sacred had been taken from it, not unless the world had already split open and swallowed everything that mattered. Sarah dropped her suitcase right there on the gravel, her heart jackknifing in her chest, because no one, not even in her darkest dreams, had ever told her what it would sound like when loyalty gave up hope. She ran to the porch, nearly falling on the last step, flung open the door with both hands, and saw it, the overturned chair, the cold tea spilled in a perfect circle, the photograph of her as a child cracked across the middle like someone had stepped on it trying to get away from something that could not be outrun. She could not yet know that Eleanor had been dead for almost 12 hours when Luna began her vigil, refusing to leave the front door, refusing to be touched, refusing, even now, to look at Sarah. She had no idea that something had gone missing from the house that night, something not listed in any will or bank account, something alive. She certainly couldn't imagine that Eleanor's death was not the end of the story, but the first strike of a match someone had been holding in secret for decades. The scream stopped the moment Sarah entered the room, not because the dog recognized her, but because Luna saw what was behind her. Sarah turned, slowly, but there was no one in the doorway. Just the wind lifting the edge of the curtain, just the faint, unmistakable smell of her grandmother's perfume, the kind she hadn't worn since the year her husband died. And then she saw it, Eleanor's hand, hanging limp off the edge of the armchair, her fingers curled as if she'd died holding something that had been taken from her at the last moment. Sarah couldn't move. Not at first. Then the envelope caught her eye, resting on the old oak sideboard like it had been waiting for this exact moment, thick, sealed, heavy with dust and dread. The writing was Eleanor's. Bold. Shaking. Meant to be seen. To my granddaughter, if the past ever finds her. Sarah reached for it with hands that didn't feel like her own. And from the far hallway, so quiet it might have been memory or madness, came the voice of someone she didn't recognize, calm as the grave. She wasn't supposed to die alone. Then why did you leave her? Sarah's voice barely crossed the room, but it landed like a stone thrown into deep, cold water, quiet, heavy, final. The woman stepped forward out of the hallway shadows, and the way Luna rose to stand between them, not growling, not barking, just watching, made Sarah's hands tremble around the letter she hadn't dared open yet. I didn't leave, the woman said, each word thick with something that sounded like rusted guilt. She made me promise not to come until it was over. Before Sarah could answer, before the next breath had fully left her chest, the woman reached slowly into her coat pocket and held out a key wrapped in soft blue cloth, trembling as she did so, like it weighed more than it should have. She gave me this 2 weeks ago, the woman continued, told me to wait for the call, told me you would come when it was time. Sarah stepped back, as if the key itself might burn her, but her eyes locked onto the cloth. She recognized it now. It was a piece of Eleanor's favorite scarf, the one she wore only when she needed courage. And then came the next blow, soft as it was cruel. She wrote you another letter, the woman said, but she never sent that one, she burned it the day before she died. Sarah felt the room narrow, her skin prickling with that awful clarity that comes when grief is suddenly tangled with doubt, and all the answers start to hide just out of reach. Who are you? She asked, more breath than voice, though every syllable hit like a hammer. The woman smiled, faint and sad, like someone remembering the exact moment a heart broke in half. I was the one she trusted when she stopped trusting anyone else, she said, lowering her eyes, and I'm the reason your name wasn't on the will. Sarah's knees nearly buckled at that, not from the money, not from the legal mess she now felt breathing down her neck, but from what it meant about who Eleanor believed she'd become. Outside, a gust of wind slammed the porch door open and shut again, like the house itself was reacting to the truth, unwilling to hold it any longer. Luna sat down again, her eyes never leaving the woman. Sarah swallowed hard, opened the letter in her hands, and read the first line aloud, her voice cracking like old timber. If you're reading this, I have already chosen who will finish what I started. The woman stepped closer, just one step, voice low and deliberate. You're not the only one who's come looking for what she left behind. And from behind the front window, a dark shape moved across the yard, slow, tall, and unmistakably human. Sarah turned sharply, already reaching for the phone that wasn't where it used to be, and whispered. "Who else knows I'm here?" "Someone who was never supposed to find this place," the woman said, her voice tightening as she reached behind the curtain and slowly pulled it closed. Sarah backed away from the window as Luna growled low in her throat, not loud, not warning, but low and steady, like she knew whatever was outside was not here by accident. The figure moved again, closer this time, cutting across the front yard without hesitation, coat heavy with rain and shoulders hunched like a man not afraid of being seen. "There's a name," the woman said, barely above a whisper now, but Eleanor never spoke it out loud, only wrote it, once, in a book she kept hidden. Sarah stared at her, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, then asked the only question that mattered, "What book?" Before the woman could answer, a hard knock hit the door, not frantic, not polite, just 3 even, deliberate strikes, as if the person behind it already owned everything inside. Sarah stood frozen, the letter still open in her hands, the last sentence now visible in her grandmother's trembling handwriting. "If they find Luna, they'll find the rest." The woman lunged for the hallway and came back with an old wooden box, no lock, just carved initials and worn hinges, and handed it to Sarah with both hands like she was passing a lit fuse. She said if this moment came, you'd have to choose, she said. Hide it, bury it, or finish it. The knock came again, this time with more weight behind it, shaking the door just enough to rattle the key hanging in the lock. Sarah opened the box slowly, as if she were lifting the lid on something that could change not just her life, but the memory of everyone who'd come before her, and inside, nestled among yellowed papers and cracked photographs, was a small velvet pouch tied shut with a single strand of Eleanor's hair. She reached in with trembling fingers, pulled the pouch free, and stared at the shape inside, a brass key, old but polished, worn down on one side like it had spent years inside someone's palm. Then came the voice from the other side of the door, clear, deep, and too calm. Sarah Eleanor Cartwright. You don't know me, but I knew your grandfather. Sarah's spine stiffened like someone had run ice down her back, and she turned to the woman, her breath coming short now, quick and sharp. What the hell is happening? The woman didn't blink, didn't breathe for a moment, and then, softly. There's something buried under this house, and if he finds it before you do, everything your grandmother protected will be gone forever. What did she bury, and why would someone kill for it? Sarah's voice shook not from fear, but from something far heavier, the unbearable weight of not knowing what kind of woman her grandmother really was. The woman didn't answer with words at first. Instead, she walked across the room, knelt beside the baseboard near the old fireplace, and pulled away a loose panel Sarah had never noticed in all her childhood summers. Behind it was a map, not drawn, but stitched, thread by thread, into the lining of what looked like one of Eleanor's old tablecloths, folded with the care of someone who knew one day it would have to be found. She didn't bury treasure, the woman said finally, her hand trembling slightly as she unfolded the cloth, revealing faded ink scrawled along the edges, coordinates, names, initials. She buried proof. Another knock echoed through the house, louder this time, closer to violent, followed by silence so deep that even the ticking of the mantel clock felt like thunder against Sarah's chest. What kind of proof? Sarah asked, her throat dry, her mind already trying to stitch together pieces that didn't yet fit. The woman didn't answer right away. She simply handed Sarah an old photograph, its edges curled, its surface cracked with age, and there, in black and white, stood Eleanor beside a man Sarah didn't recognize, but whose name had been whispered in the house once before. On the back of the photo were 5 words, written in Eleanor's steady hand. He said no one would believe me. That's when Sarah understood, not everything, not yet, but enough to know that whatever her grandmother had hidden beneath that house wasn't gold, or bonds, or something a lawyer could sort through. It was a truth someone powerful had tried to erase, and now that Sarah had come back, someone was making sure it stayed buried. The front door handle began to turn, slow at first, then faster, and Luna bolted upright, not barking, not whining, but growling low and deep like she had just remembered what it meant to protect. Sarah grabbed the map, the box, the photo, and backed into the kitchen as the door creaked open just enough for a man's voice to slip through the crack. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, not yelling, not threatening, just promising something, "before I stop being polite." The woman didn't flinch. She turned to Sarah, handed her the brass key again, and whispered urgently, "The cellar door, behind the tool bench. If the lock turns twice, you'll see the hatch in the floorboards." Sarah's hands were shaking as she felt the weight of the key in her palm, not just metal, but memory, and consequence. And then came the sentence that turned her blood cold. "He doesn't care about the truth, Sarah, he's here to make sure no one ever hears it again. Tell me what's down there before I open it, please," Sarah whispered, her back pressed against the old cellar door as footsteps crossed the porch above them, slow, measured, unhurried, like a man certain he would not need to knock again. The woman leaned in close, voice tight with urgency but softened by something older than fear, the voice of someone who had carried the burden of someone else's secrets for too many years without rest. "Down there," she said, as the lock clicked once beneath Sarah's hand, "is the only evidence left of what your grandfather did, and what your grandmother risked everything to stop." A sharp knock cracked through the floorboards above, followed by a voice that no longer tried to sound friendly. "Last warning, after this, the door comes down." Sarah turned the key again, and with a sound like a sigh from beneath the earth, the bolt gave way, revealing a narrow staircase swallowed by darkness, the scent of damp wood and old iron rising like something exhaled after decades of silence. She descended slowly, each step groaning beneath her weight, Luna close behind, the dog's body tense, head low, as if she remembered the place not as it was, but as it had been. At the bottom, lit only by a small emergency lantern the woman handed down, lay a row of wooden crates, each marked with Eleanor's initials and numbered with dates that stretched back farther than Sarah had expected, dates that reached beyond her own birth, back into a time no one in the family spoke of anymore. Sarah opened the nearest crate with trembling hands and pulled out a reel of film, brittle and cold to the touch, labeled in fading pencil, June 1961, Camp Resolute, internal footage, unauthorized. She looked up, her voice dry as dust. "What is this?" The woman knelt beside her and unfolded a newspaper clipping she had taken from the box, yellowed, torn at the edges, but still legible, the headline reading: "Coastal Youth Camp closes after tragic fire, no charges filed." Sarah felt the words before she could read them, her chest hollowing out with every breath, her voice cracking when she finally asked, "You mean to tell me Grandpa was part of that?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she placed a single, sealed envelope in Sarah's hand, smaller than the others, its seal still intact, Eleanor's writing firm and clear despite the years. "For Sarah. To be opened only if he comes looking." Sarah opened it, her hands shaking now not from fear, but from something deeper, that kind of sorrow that turns into rage when it's too late to change anything. Inside was a single sentence, written with a clarity that cut like a knife. "He did it. And I stayed quiet to protect you." A sudden crash above shattered the moment, the front door splintered open, heavy boots thudding against the floor, and Luna barked once, sharp and full of warning. The woman grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, eyes wide with everything she had never been allowed to say out loud. "Your grandfather," she whispered, "he ran that camp. And Eleanor found out what really happened to those missing girls." Sarah stepped back, her hands clutching the letter, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "She buried the truth, to protect me from my own name." And from the top of the cellar stairs, a voice growled low and final. "She couldn't bury it deep enough. She couldn't bury it deep enough." The voice at the top of the stairs was older now, thinner than she remembered, but there was no mistaking its cold authority. It carried the kind of weight that didn't ask for silence but expected it. Sarah turned toward the stairs, her fingers still gripping the letter like it might burn straight through her hands if she let it go, her body frozen in place not by fear but by a dawning horror she could no longer deny. The man stepped into view, tall, sharp-eyed, with a military stiffness that hadn't aged out of his posture, and though she hadn't seen him since she was a child, something in his presence made her knees lock and her breath catch. "You kept her letters," he said flatly, as if accusing her of treason, not grief. You weren't supposed to see any of this. Luna stepped forward, teeth bared just enough to show she remembered him too, not from affection, but from instinct, as if she knew which ghosts didn't deserve forgiveness. Sarah's voice came low, ragged, barely hanging on. You ran that camp, you knew what happened to those girls, and you let it burn instead of speaking up. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink, just moved closer with that same quiet menace she remembered from family dinners that always ended too early, with too many things left unsaid. I did what I had to do, he said, almost gently, like he believed it. What your grandmother didn't understand was that some things are better left buried. The woman beside Sarah moved between them then, not out of fear, but with the calm defiance of someone who had spent her life waiting for this exact confrontation. She understood plenty, she said, her voice firm, eyes locked on him like steel. She just didn't want your shame to become your granddaughter's inheritance. His expression cracked, just for a second, and in that second, Sarah saw what she needed to see, guilt not born of regret, but of exposure. He reached into his coat, not with speed but with confidence, as if whatever he was reaching for would settle everything without argument. But Luna moved first. In one fluid motion, the dog lunged forward, teeth sinking into the fabric of his sleeve, dragging him back from the stairs with a snarl that echoed like thunder in the stone-walled cellar. He stumbled, crashing hard into the shelves behind him, sending a rain of photographs and film reels scattering across the floor like fragments of a life he could no longer control. Sarah stepped over the broken box and stood over him, heart pounding, letter still in hand. You buried the truth, she said, voice clear, strong, and steady now, but she left me the key to dig it up. He looked at her then, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous, certainty. You release that footage, he said, breathless, bruised, and you'll burn down more than just a name. You'll bury the family with it. Sarah stared down at him, then at Luna, then at the woman who had waited a lifetime for someone to do the right thing. And with the calm clarity of someone who had finally remembered who she was, she whispered. Then let it all burn. Then let it all burn. Sarah's words hadn't even finished echoing off the cellar walls when the man lunged, not for her, not for the woman, but straight for the crate still filled with evidence, hands grasping wildly like he could erase decades of guilt in one desperate movement. Before Sarah could react, Luna threw herself between them again, not out of anger, but with the protective rage of something that remembered every raised voice, every slammed door, every wrong thing done in that house long after dark. The woman kicked the lid shut just as his hands touched the edge, and Sarah drove the key back into the lock, twisting it hard until it snapped in place, splintering the wood but sealing the truth inside long enough to survive the moment. He backed away then, chest heaving, eyes wild, and for the first time since his name had been whispered in the house, he looked smaller than she remembered. They'll never believe you, he hissed, eyes darting toward the ruined film, the scattered photos, the shattered silence. Even with all this, no one wants to hear stories like that anymore. Sarah bent down slowly, picked up the photograph of Eleanor and the unknown girl standing beneath the trees of Camp Resolute, one girl circled in pen, her face blurred by time, her name written in block letters beneath it. Miriam, last seen June 9, 1961. She held it up, voice trembling but sure, we don't need everyone to believe us. We just need one person brave enough to tell the truth. From the top of the cellar stairs came a sudden creak, and a second figure stepped into view, flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the dust and chaos. It was the sheriff, local, quiet, loyal to Eleanor for years, and his voice was low, almost reverent, when he finally spoke. We've been waiting for this to come out, he said, eyes on the man now cowering near the wall. Some of us always suspected, but we needed more than whispers. The man didn't speak again. They walked him out without handcuffs, but not gently, Luna following behind like a shadow that refused to forget what it had seen. Hours later, Sarah sat in the kitchen with the woman beside her, the letter open on the table now, its words no longer heavy, but freeing. She ran her fingers along the edge of the map, tracing her grandmother's handwriting, and whispered, more to the room than to herself, she carried this secret her whole life, and all I ever saw was her silence. The woman smiled, faint and tired, like someone who could finally sleep after decades of pretending not to hear ghosts. She didn't stay quiet out of weakness, she said softly, she stayed quiet so you wouldn't carry the shame she did. Sarah looked out the window then, eyes on the ocean just beyond the trees, and asked what she hadn't been able to before. Do you think she forgave herself, in the end? The woman placed her hand over Sarah's and said the only thing that mattered now. I think she left that for you to decide. I think she left that for you to decide. The kitchen window shattered before Sarah could answer, glass exploding inward with the force of something more than wind, as a brick the size of a man's fist crashed across the table, scattering papers, breaking the lamp and throwing Luna into a barking frenzy. Sarah hit the floor, instinct taking over, arms shielding her head, heart galloping in her chest like it remembered war stories her body had never lived but somehow always feared. The woman dove toward the hallway, pulling Sarah by the arm, dragging her behind the pantry door just as a second object, heavier, sharper, clattered through the window frame and skidded across the kitchen tile. When the noise settled, only Luna's growl remained, low and rumbling, body pressed tight against the door, ears locked on whatever waited outside. Sarah reached for the fallen brick, heart still hammering, and found something tied around it, a strip of old linen soaked through with motor oil and a single note scrawled in thick black ink. Some names should stay buried. You've been warned. She stared at the message, her hands trembling, then looked to the woman with a whisper that barely held together. I thought it ended when he was taken. The woman shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowed not with panic but with something harder, recognition. There was always someone behind him, she said softly, someone who gave the order while he kept his hands clean. Sarah's throat tightened around a dozen questions, but only one made it out, do you know who? The woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the same one she'd carried since Eleanor died, the one Sarah had seen but never questioned. She opened it carefully, turned to a marked page near the center, and handed it to Sarah without a word. There, written in Eleanor's unmistakable hand, were 3 names, 2 crossed out in red, and 1 circled in blue ink so deeply the page had torn beneath the pressure. Judge William C. Harrow, 1961-1986-2009. Sarah stared at the name, her memory clawing backward, and then she saw it, not in words, but in a faded photo on the hallway wall, a man in uniform shaking hands with her grandfather beneath the Camp Resolute sign, smiling like they'd just secured the future of something that should never have existed. She dropped the notebook, blood rushing in her ears, the truth closing in again like smoke with no fire. This wasn't just about what he did, Sarah said, her voice low, filled with the dread of revelation. It's about what they kept doing, even after the camp burned. The woman stepped back, eyes on the door, as sirens echoed faintly in the distance, slow at first, then louder. Sarah turned to her, her voice steady now despite the storm she felt building inside. If this name's still alive, what are we going to do about it? We're going to finish what Eleanor started, and we're going to do it before he disappears again. The woman didn't wait for Sarah's reply, she grabbed the keys from the counter, yanked open the back door, and motioned for her to follow, fast and low, as the sirens that had been approaching turned sharply and then began to fade, veering away like someone had made a phone call to misdirect them. Sarah stepped into the dark, wet yard, clutching the notebook with the judge's name circled so hard it had nearly torn through the page, her mind racing with every detail of the face in that photo, the proud handshake, the polished shoes, the smile that meant safety but now reeked of something far worse. They reached the old pickup truck behind the shed, rusted but faithful, and before Sarah could even close the passenger door, the woman handed her a burner phone already dialing. When he ran for circuit judge, Eleanor clipped every article, she said, voice hard as the gravel they tore across. He buried the last girl himself, we just didn't know where. Sarah pressed the phone to her ear just as it clicked through, and a tired male voice answered with a name she hadn't heard in over 20 years. Marshall speaking. The woman leaned over the wheel and said, without looking at Sarah, tell him it's about Camp Resolute. And tell him the granddaughter is ready to speak. Sarah didn't blink, didn't breathe, just said the words with a steadiness that felt older than her years. "This is Sarah Cartwright. I have what you've been waiting for." The silence on the line lasted just long enough to pull her chest tight, then came the quiet, loaded reply. "Where do you want to meet?" An hour later, they pulled into the back lot of a shuttered church on the edge of town, the kind of place where secrets didn't echo and trust wasn't given, only exchanged. Marshall, tall, older, tired, stepped out of a dark sedan with eyes that scanned like someone who never stopped expecting an ambush, even in daylight. He nodded at Sarah, then turned to the woman. "I didn't think you'd bring her in," he said softly. "She brought herself," the woman answered, arms crossed, body tense. Marshall opened a briefcase on the hood of the car and laid out a series of documents, public records, redacted statements, faded photos of children who were never supposed to be remembered. Then he slid one across the hood to Sarah, an arrest warrant with Judge William C. Harrow's name printed in bold at the top, and signed. Sarah stared down at it, her breath catching in her throat. "You had this ready?" Marshall looked at her with the weight of a man who had been waiting for one name, one moment, for half his life. "We've been ready for years. What we never had, was someone willing to put their family's name on the fire." Sarah closed her eyes, Eleanor's voice echoing from the letter, "He did it. And I stayed quiet to protect you." When she opened them, her voice didn't shake. "Then strike the match." Marshall slid the paper back into the briefcase, snapped it shut, and said the words that turned everything from memory to action. "He's speaking at a veterans fundraiser in 24 hours. If you show up with Luna and that box of evidence, he won't walk out." Sarah stared into the night, her heart steady now. "Then we end it tomorrow. They won't check your bag, not if you walk in with Luna by your side and your eyes fixed on the flag." The woman's voice rang clear through Sarah's mind as she stepped through the high-arched double doors of the VFW hall, where red, white, and blue bunting hung like aging masks meant to distract from what had always been hidden beneath. Every eye in the crowd turned for just a second as she entered, not long enough to raise suspicion, but just enough to notice the dog, just enough to wonder who she was and why her gaze didn't flicker like the rest. The judge was already speaking. From the podium, his voice rolled across the room with practiced gravity, full of patriotism and pride, quoting duty and sacrifice like gospel, hands raised for applause as if the world owed him a standing ovation simply for surviving. Sarah moved through the crowd slowly, deliberately, clutching the old wooden box against her chest like a child holds memory, not to show it, but to protect it. Luna never took her eyes off the stage. And the moment their eyes met, Sarah's and the judge's, it was as if the noise dropped out of the room, like history had finally caught up with him, and every word he meant to say died in the back of his throat. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled around the edge of the podium. His voice rose half a pitch as if he could out-talk the truth before it arrived. But Sarah didn't stop. She reached the front row as Marshall entered through the rear doors with two plainclothes officers in step behind him, no sirens, no shouting, just the steady, methodical rhythm of justice walking through the front door after spending decades on the porch. Sarah stepped onto the stage, opened the box, and set its contents on the podium in front of him, one reel of film, two photographs, one letter, and the name tag from a burned camp uniform stitched with the word, Miriam. Gasps rippled through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but deep and full of confusion, the sound of old veterans realizing something holy had just cracked wide open. The judge stepped back from the microphone, his face pale, one hand searching for something behind him, support, denial, control, but finding nothing but air. "You remember me," Sarah said quietly, no microphone needed, her voice cutting through the silence like winter through glass. "You called me Sunflower, the last time I saw you." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "Do you remember what you said to my grandmother?" she continued, her eyes never leaving his, "when she found the first girl buried near the chapel ruins?" His lips parted, and this time, a sound escaped, not denial, not protest, but a low, guttural plea. "I tried to stop it." Sarah stepped forward, just enough for the whole room to see her face, Just enough for Luna to rise beside her, every inch of her body radiating a protective silence sharper than teeth. "No," Sarah said. "You tried to survive it. She tried to end it." Marshall raised a hand. The officers stepped forward. The judge's legs gave out. And as they lifted him to his feet, the letter fell from the podium and landed at Sarah's boots, the one Eleanor had written on her final night, the one meant to be opened only when the last name was spoken aloud. Sarah bent down slowly, picked it up, unfolded the page with hands steadier than they'd been in days, and read her grandmother's final words aloud. "What I couldn't carry to the grave, I've passed to you. What you do with it, is how we both get to rest. What you do with it, is how we both get to rest." The letter slipped from Sarah's fingers the moment she finished reading it aloud, but its weight remained, hanging in the room heavier than the silence that followed the judge's arrest, heavier than the applause that never came, heavier than the years everyone pretended had never happened. Luna pressed against Sarah's leg as if to say that it was done, but Sarah knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that endings didn't come with applause, or justice, or headlines. Endings came in choices. And her choice hadn't yet been made. As the officers walked the judge out beneath the stunned eyes of the local press, who had arrived late but smelled blood and history in equal measure, Sarah turned back to the podium, to the items on display, and reached for the photograph of Miriam. She turned it over slowly, reading the words Eleanor had written in her steady, deliberate hand. "Tell her name. Even if they forget mine." The room was still watching her, some angry, some confused, some just tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. And Sarah understood what had to come next. She picked up the microphone with the same hands her grandmother once used to hold a book of lesson plans, the same hands that once braided her hair while humming a song with no words, and said, not loudly, but clearly. There were 23 girls enrolled at Camp Resolute that summer. 4 never came home. 2 were buried quietly. 1 was never found. She looked at the sheriff standing near the back, saw his hat held against his chest, his eyes misted with something he hadn't let himself feel until now. "My name is Sarah Eleanor Cartwright," she continued, the sound of it both familiar and foreign, "and for the record, I believe them." Outside, the wind shifted. The woman, now leaning in the doorway like someone watching the final scene of a play she'd memorized years ago, gave Sarah a faint nod and whispered the words she'd been waiting decades to say. "You finished it." But Sarah shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I continued it." 3 months later, the court ruled to unseal the files related to the camp's closure. Federal hearings were opened. 2 more names surfaced, one in the military, one in a religious institution, both men now gone, but their shadows dragged into daylight by the truth Eleanor had buried in silence and Sarah had unearthed in fire. The house by the sea was quiet now, the porch light fixed, the shutters freshly painted. Sarah lived there full time, teaching art in the sunroom where Eleanor once wrote letters she never mailed. Luna, older but watchful, still sat at the front gate every evening at sunset, her ears twitching toward the wind, like she was waiting for someone she loved to walk up the road one last time. One morning, Sarah found another letter, this one folded into the lining of the box she'd nearly burned after the trial, and when she opened it, Eleanor's final message was scrawled in her softest script. "You were always braver than me. That's why I waited. That's why I chose you." Sarah folded the note gently, pressed it to her chest, and walked to the water's edge as the morning tide began to rise. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, and let the wind carry her grandmother's name, not as a secret, not as a wound, but as a story finally told. And far behind her, Luna lay down beside the garden path, closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, slept without standing guard.